Hey guys, tonight we're diving into how did the assassination of Abraham Lincoln affect American society. Forget everything Hollywood told you. This is the real story, and trust me, you probably wouldn't last a day. So before you get too comfortable, hit that like button if you enjoy this kind of deep dive, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe grab a snack, and let's jump in. You wake up in Washington, D.C., and the air smells like horses, cigar smoke, and wet spring dirt. The Civil War has just ended. People are relieved, but they're also exhausted, paranoid, and broke, like post-season 5 of Game of Thrones emotionally bankrupt. But tonight's different. People are flooding into Ford's Theater to see a British farce called Our American Cousin. And guess who shows up in the presidential box? Yep, Abraham Lincoln himself. Tall hat, tired eyes, a man who's aged like a bad banana under the weight of 4 years of war. But he's smiling again, just a little, and then, bang. One shot, behind the ear, a puff of gunpowder. John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and Confederate sympathizer, leaps from the box to the stage, yells something in Latin like he's auditioning for a Roman revenge play. Sic semper tyrannis. And limps off into history. Literally. He breaks his leg on the landing. 0/10 exit form. Now let's get real. This wasn't just the death of a president. It was the assassination of hope. Lincoln had just started talking about healing, about mercy, about reconstruction, not just rebuilding cities, but rebuilding people. And now, he's gone. And suddenly, America's like a ship with no captain, drifting straight into a storm. You ever seen a nation emotionally spiral? In the days after the assassination, the country falls into something like stunned grief. Cities shut down. People weep in the streets. Schools close. Ministers cry mid-sermon. The funeral procession becomes a 14-day national event, a slow-motion heartbreak parade across 7 states. Imagine a TikTok live stream that lasts 2 weeks, with millions mourning in real time, except everyone's in black and covered in soot. Oh, and there's a manhunt, the largest in U.S. history. More than 10,000 troops chasing Booth through forests, swamps, and barns. Spoiler, he ends up shot and half burned in a tobacco shed. Not exactly a glamorous ending for Mr. Latin monologue. Here's the real twist. Lincoln's death didn't just affect feelings. It changed the entire trajectory of post-war America. You remember that scene in a movie where the wise old mentor dies too soon and the reckless apprentice takes over. Yeah, meet Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's VP, a Southern Democrat, a guy who literally held a bottle of whiskey during his own inauguration. He took office and basically said, "Let's forgive the South. Also, let's ignore black rights. Cool, cool." Under Johnson, Reconstruction goes from "let's rebuild together" to "let's just pretend everything's fine." The Freedmen's Bureau gets kneecapped, black codes return, and white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan rise from the ashes like evil phoenixes in bedsheets. So yeah, Lincoln's assassination didn't just hurt emotionally. It broke the fragile bridge between war and peace, between slavery and equality. You might be thinking, okay, tragic. But that was 160 years ago. Why should I care? Because this moment, this exact moment, was the fork in the road. If Lincoln had lived, maybe Reconstruction would have stuck. Maybe civil rights wouldn't have taken another 100 years to even start being realized. Instead, the country hit pause on progress, and people paid for that delay with blood, poverty, and centuries of division. So next time you hear someone say, "The past is the past," you can remind them, yeah, but some pasts never really die. They just wait for an encore. Okay, so Lincoln is dead. Johnson is president. And America? She's not doing well. You ever try to fix something just enough to make it look okay, but underneath, it's still cracked and moldy and smells weird? That's Reconstruction. On the surface, the country is reunited. The Civil War is over. The states are technically back together, but you look a little closer, and you'll see the stitches are jagged, infected, and bleeding. Let's walk through it. Freedom smells like, well, mud, gunpowder, and leftover ashes from your former owner's burned plantation. You don't own land. You can't vote in most states. And if you try to leave and build a life somewhere else, there are gangs of angry men in hoods who believe their war isn't over yet. These aren't just individual bad guys. This is organized. This is systemic. You're technically free, but the world you're walking into is filled with legal landmines. And here's the kicker. The one person who had the political finesse, the popularity, and the moral clarity to actually navigate this nightmare, Lincoln, is gone. In his place, Andrew, I veto everything Johnson. Quick refresher. The 14th Amendment says everyone born in the U.S. gets equal protection under the law. Sounds nice, right? Well, Johnson tried to kill it. Imagine watching someone try to undo the basic rules of a game while the game is still happening. Congress, fed up with his nonsense, basically says, you know what? You're done. They impeach him in 1868. He survives by one vote in the Senate. 1. So let's recap real quick. Lincoln is dead. Johnson is drunk, angry, and vetoing everything that helps former slaves. Congress is holding the country together with duct tape and wishful thinking. And meanwhile, the South? It's busy rewriting its version of history. You ever heard the phrase, the lost cause? It's not a Netflix drama. It's the name of a propaganda campaign that swept across the South in the decades after Lincoln's death. The message? The Civil War wasn't really about slavery. It was about states' rights. The Confederacy was noble. The South was heroic. And Lincoln? Let's just say he had it coming. Wild, right? But this myth spreads like wildfire. Textbooks start telling the cleaned-up version. Statues of Confederate generals pop up like mushrooms after rain. And entire generations grow up learning a story where the villains are the martyrs. Why does this matter? Because this is how historical trauma gets buried under marble and myth. Lincoln's death didn't just leave a power vacuum, it left a truth vacuum. And where there's a truth vacuum, lies move in fast. Let's play What If. Let's say John Wilkes Booth missed. Or the bullet just grazed Lincoln's head, and he came back with a new nickname, like Honest Abe the Unkillable. What would have changed? Well, for starters, Lincoln had a plan. A real one. Not perfect, but one that focused on forgiveness with accountability. He didn't want to punish the South just to punish it, but he also wasn't about to let it re-enslave people through back doors. He knew how to talk to people. Not scream, not tweet, not throw vetoes like confetti. He could speak to the nation's trauma without fanning the flames. He had public trust. Even people who hated his policies respected him. That matters. Leadership matters. Would America have healed faster? Maybe. Would racism and inequality magically vanish? Definitely not. But maybe, just maybe, we wouldn't still be dealing with echoes of Reconstruction in every voting rights case, every protest, every debate about monuments and memory. Here's the eerie part. After Lincoln died, people started seeing him. No, seriously, there are ghost stories. White House staff claimed they heard his footsteps late at night. Visitors, including Winston Churchill, said they saw his shadow in the hall. It's like the country couldn't let him go. And honestly, maybe it shouldn't have. Because Lincoln wasn't just a president. He became a kind of haunted what if. A reminder of a different road we could have taken. Okay, so Lincoln dies. The country mourns. The government limps forward. And then something weird happens. Abraham Lincoln starts turning into a saint. Not literally, of course. But his image? It stops being just a face on a $5 bill and starts becoming a symbol, a vibe, a myth. You know how every culture has that one tragic hero who dies too soon and becomes larger than life? King Arthur, Joan of Arc, Tupac? Yeah, Lincoln becomes that for America. But here's the twist. It's not always honest. Suddenly, statues of Lincoln start popping up all over the country. Schools get named after him. His words are carved into marble. There's a giant seated version of him looming over D.C. like a stone deity. And every president after him, they want a little piece of that Lincoln sparkle. You can literally trace a straight line from Lincoln to Obama, quoting him in speeches, to Trump surrounding himself with Lincoln busts, to every modern president invoking his better angels when things get messy. Lincoln became the moral measuring stick, which is ironic considering how controversial he was while alive. It's like the country couldn't handle how complex he was, so instead, it repackaged him as a perfect symbol. Honest Abe, the great emancipator, the man who saved the Union. Except real life, messier, grayer, full of contradictions, kinda like, well, history in general. Let's talk ripple effects. Because Lincoln's death didn't just traumatize his own generation, it set a pattern. Fast forward. 1881, Garfield assassinated. 1901, McKinley assassinated. 1963, JFK assassinated on live television. And each time, the country doesn't just mourn. It spirals. We panic. We mythologize. We build elaborate memorials. We rewrite history in real time. Because ever since Lincoln, we've learned that killing a president is more than just killing a person. It's killing a narrative. A nation's storyline gets blown apart, and people rush in to patch it together however they can, with statues, conspiracy theories, national holidays, and museum gift shops. Here's a question for you, maybe a tough one. What do we actually remember about Lincoln today? Be honest, most people know. He freed the slaves, sort of. Emancipation was more limited than people think. He wore a funny hat. He got shot in a theater. But what about his support for colonization plans that would have sent freed black Americans out of the U.S.? His suspension of habeas corpus during wartime? His gradual evolution on racial equality, which wasn't always linear or ideal? See, the real Lincoln was complicated. Brilliant, yes, but also flawed, political, strategic. A president, not a prophet. But because he was assassinated, we never got to see him age, make mistakes, say something dumb on camera, get canceled on Twitter. Instead, we get the version of Lincoln that history froze in amber, the one we can use however we like. And that's dangerous, because when we flatten people into symbols, we stop learning from them. All right, bring it back to you. What does Lincoln's assassination mean for us in 2025? It's about memory. It's about power. It's about how nations cope with loss, and how we rewrite the past to make the present feel safer. Because when things fall apart, when truth feels slippery, and everyone's yelling online, we tend to reach for legends. We polish them. We frame them. We say, if only we had another Lincoln. But maybe what we really need is to stop wishing for ghosts and start learning from the messy, real version of history. Lincoln wasn't perfect. America isn't either. But the question isn't, was he a hero? It's, what do we choose to remember? And what do we quietly let slip away? Let's talk politics. Because not even a presidential corpse stays out of politics for long. After Lincoln died, he didn't just become mourned. He became marketed. Republicans, still riding high as the party of Lincoln, saw an opportunity. They branded themselves not just as the party of victory in the Civil War, but the party of moral destiny. Translation, we're the good guys, we had Lincoln. You had Jefferson Davis. Case closed. And it worked, for a while. Lincoln became the ultimate moral trump card. No pun intended. Want to shut down a Southern argument? Quote Lincoln. Want to justify Reconstruction policies? Channel Lincoln. Want to win an election? Slap Lincoln's name on a banner and call it a legacy. But politics is never that simple, because as Lincoln rose into myth, the country kept splintering beneath him. While the North was busy building statues and naming schools, the South was doing something else entirely. It was rebranding. It didn't take long for Southern leaders, writers, and pastors to start crafting a story, one where Lincoln wasn't a savior, but a tyrant, an invader, a war criminal, a man who destroyed states' rights in the name of big, bloated government. This wasn't just fringe talk. It became cultural canon. Southern textbooks rewrote the war as a noble defense of tradition. Lincoln became the boogeyman in parlor stories and political speeches. And this fracture, this dueling memory, never really healed. Even today you'll see it, Confederate flags waving next to God Bless America bumper stickers. People quoting Lincoln out of context to argue against the very causes he died supporting. Debates about monuments that reveal we're still not sure what story we're telling. Lincoln's assassination didn't end the Civil War. It just made it go cold. Jump forward a few decades. 1922. America unveils the Lincoln Memorial. Massive, regal, almost temple-like. He sits in silence, hands folded, eyes forward, no sword, no crown, just a man watching. But here's the twist. When they built the memorial, Black Americans weren't even allowed to attend the dedication freely. It was a segregated event. Yes, the memorial to the man who freed the slaves. Segregated. History has layers, my friends, like an onion soaked in irony. But then, flash forward again. August 28th, 1963. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stands on the steps of that very memorial and delivers the I Have a Dream speech. Lincoln, stone-faced behind him, becomes the silent witness to America's next Civil War, the war for civil rights. And suddenly, the statue means something new. It becomes a stage, a symbol, a question mark. Are we living up to the dream, or just posing in front of it? Today, Lincoln is a brand. There are Lincoln coffee mugs, Lincoln action figures, Lincoln vampire hunter movies. Yes, that happened. We've turned him into everything. A sage, a meme of a sage. And that's kind of the problem. Because the more we flatten Lincoln into a two-dimensional saint, the easier it is to ignore the hard stuff. His slow evolution on race, his use of wartime powers that stretched the Constitution, his political calculations that sometimes contradicted his ideals. We forget that greatness isn't perfection. It's struggle, it's contradiction, it's growth under pressure. And maybe that's the real reason his death hit so hard. Because he wasn't done yet, and neither were we. Let's rewind for a second. Before Lincoln, the U.S. presidency was powerful, but it wasn't exactly mythic. Presidents were important, sure, but they were still seen as temporary managers of the republic, not destiny-shaping avatars of the American soul. Then, boom, one bullet, one death, and suddenly the office becomes sacred. Lincoln's assassination turned the presidency into something more than a job. It became a stage, a symbol, a target. Before Lincoln's assassination, presidential security was, let's say, relaxed. No Secret Service, no bulletproof glass, no armored limos. Lincoln literally rode around D.C. by himself, sometimes even walking the streets at night, with no security. That'd be like Joe Biden catching an Uber to Starbucks with just sunglasses and vibes. After Lincoln, everything changed. The U.S. government realized, oh, the president can be killed. And if that happens, the entire country starts glitching like a Windows 95 update. So the Secret Service, originally created to fight counterfeiting, was reassigned to protect presidents. White House security turned from gentlemen in top hats to full-on Fortress America mode. By the 20th century, presidential protection became an institution, not just out of fear, but because Lincoln's death proved just how fragile democracy really is when one person becomes its emotional anchor. Here's a twist you didn't learn in school. Lincoln's assassination didn't just create a security crisis, it created a power crisis. When Andrew Johnson took over, there wasn't a clear idea of what a president should do during a time like that. And you could feel the growing pains. Johnson fought with Congress. Congress tried to strip his power. At one point, he literally tried to fire a cabinet member that Congress had protected with law. And that led to his impeachment. So in the chaos, a strange thing happened. The presidency began to evolve. Not through law, through myth. People started expecting their president to be more than a law passer. They wanted a unifier, a savior, a symbol. Presidents became voices of conscience, faces of mourning, war leaders, crisis managers. And in doing so, the office became both more powerful and more vulnerable. We don't talk about it much, but every time a president steps on stage, at a rally, at a debate, in front of cameras, there's this quiet, invisible weight in the air. The memory that it happened once, that it could happen again. JFK in Dallas, Reagan in D.C., even recent attempts, some stopped, some dangerously close. You can trace a straight line from Lincoln's assassination to the bulletproof glass behind modern presidents, the armored limos called the Beast, and the intense theater of presidential appearances. Because we're not just watching leaders, we're watching targets, and every president since Lincoln lives with that ghost. Some embrace it, some flinch from it, but it's always there. Here's something no politician will say on a podium. The U.S. government, for all its flags and rituals and marble columns, is deeply fragile. Lincoln's death proved that. All it took was one man with a pistol and a twisted ideology, and America almost derailed its own rebirth. The war had just ended. The country was bleeding. And then the one guy with a moral compass and a decent vocabulary is gone, and suddenly we're tossing Reconstruction to the wolves. That should terrify you, because it means the Republic isn't inevitable. It's maintained by choices, institutions, and people can die. Let's end this chapter with a thought experiment. Imagine you're elected president. Congrats! Now picture this. You're sitting in the Oval Office. Behind your desk and over your shoulder, there's a painting of Abraham Lincoln. He's not smiling. He's watching. Presidents look at Lincoln's legacy like a warning label. Do good, speak well, unite the people, or be remembered as the reason it all cracked again. That's the burden Lincoln's assassination left behind. It didn't just martyr him. It etched him like a watermark into every presidency that followed. Here's something they don't show you in the textbooks. When Lincoln died, not everyone mourned the same way. Sure, newspapers printed oceans of grief, but grief isn't one size fits all. It's filtered through who you are, what you've lost, and what kind of future you think just got erased. Lincoln's assassination wasn't just a tragedy. It was a Rorschach test. Depending on who you were, it meant the end of salvation, or the return of the old world you were hoping to escape. Let's start with the people who had the most at stake. For 4 long years, enslaved people watched the war like a storm cloud. And then, freedom. Not perfect freedom, not safe freedom, but still, a crack in the sky. To many, Lincoln was more than a president. He was a deliverer. A flawed one, yes, but a symbol of hope. So when the news hit, April 15th, 1865, black churches held mourning services so crowded people stood outside in the rain. They wept. They sang spirituals with his name in them. They prayed, not just for his soul, but for their own future, now hanging by a thread, because they knew what white politicians were already whispering in back rooms. Lincoln is dead. Maybe now we don't have to follow through. And they were right to worry. Not everyone mourned. In parts of the South, the reaction was, let's say, chilly. Some folks were openly relieved. Some threw parties. One Southern woman reportedly shouted, "He got what he deserved," and was nearly strangled by a Union soldier right then and there. Booth, to many in the defeated Confederacy, wasn't just a criminal. He was a folk hero. They saw him as avenging the Southern cause, even though his actions actually made things worse for the South. Talk about missing the plot. Lincoln had pushed for leniency and reconciliation. Booth killed the one man most likely to help the South heal. Which just goes to show, sometimes the people who cheer your win are actually cheering your long-term destruction. Now let's zoom in on the veterans. These were the men who had followed Lincoln's war orders for 4 brutal years. Through the mud of Antietam, The slaughter of Gettysburg, the fire of Sherman's march. He was their commander-in-chief, their wartime North Star. And when he died, many didn't just mourn, they broke. Letters from Union soldiers describe weeping uncontrollably, wandering around camp like ghosts. One wrote, "We've lost more than a man. We've lost the reason we kept fighting." That's the thing with war. You don't just need orders, you need belief. And Lincoln, despite everything, gave them that. To the newly arrived Irish dockworker, to the German refugee who fled European wars, to the Chinese laborer dreaming of a railroad job. Lincoln's death was a weird signal. Was America really the land of promise, or just a violent mess in a tall hat? For many immigrants, Lincoln represented the dream of a country that might be better than the one they left, and when that dream got shot in the head in a theater. You could feel the cracks form in that faith. Some stayed. Some sent word back home. America's not what we thought. Now let's talk about the women. Remember, this was 1865. No voting rights, no Senate seats, no podcasts. But women still felt the assassination acutely because they'd lost sons to this war. Brothers, husbands, they'd waited for peace, waited for hope. And when Lincoln died, it was like losing the only adult in the room. Northern women held memorial sewing circles, organized food drives for soldiers, and sent handwritten letters of grief to his widow, Mary Todd Lincoln. And speaking of Mary, imagine her trauma. She's sitting next to her husband, watching a comedy. He's laughing. Then, blood. She was never the same. She spiraled into grief, eventually institutionalized for mental illness. But history, of course, mostly remembers her as a little crazy. That's the cost of being a woman in history. Your pain becomes a footnote. So let's bring this all together. Lincoln dies. But he doesn't just leave behind a grieving nation. He leaves behind a fractured one. Everyone's reacting through their own lens. Black Americans. Will we survive this? Confederates? Can we claw back power? Soldiers? Was this all for nothing? Immigrants? Is this country even stable? Women? What future is left for our children? One assassination. 1,000 reactions. All tangled in the messy, contradictory soul of America. You're sitting in a red velvet seat. It's April 14th, 1865. The play is halfway through. People are laughing. There's perfume in the air. The orchestra's string section is just warming up. And then, bang. A man slumps in the presidential box. A woman screams. The actors freeze. The audience doesn't know if it's part of the act, but it's not. That theater, Ford's Theater, stopped being a stage that night. It became something else, a wound in the middle of the Capitol. After Lincoln's assassination, Ford's Theater was shut down immediately. Not for weeks, not for months. For over 100 years, it became a cursed building, a haunted monument. People couldn't go back to laughing there. How could you? You don't reopen a comedy club where a president bled out. The U.S. government actually bought the building, not to use it, but to repurpose it. At various points, it was an office building, a records archive, a museum. And briefly, the site of another deadly collapse that killed over 20 clerks in 1893. Yeah, bad energy. It wasn't until 1968, more than a century later, that it finally reopened as a theater. Even then, the ghost of Lincoln never left. He's baked into the walls. His box is still there, sealed off, untouched. A theatrical tomb. Before Lincoln, presidential deaths were solemn, but mostly quiet. But Lincoln's assassination? It unleashed a new kind of grief. National, loud, theatrical. His funeral train took 14 days to travel from D.C. to Springfield, Illinois. Hundreds of thousands lined the tracks. Many had never seen a train before, let alone one carrying a dead president. There were flowers in every station. Black mourning veils sold out nationwide. Entire towns were draped in black crepe, like the country itself was in costume. And it wasn't just sadness. It was performance. America didn't just cry, it created a mourning ritual, a script we still follow today. You see it after JFK, after 9/11s, after national tragedies, flags at half-mast, candlelight vigils, public eulogies, hashtags, speeches that quote Lincoln. Because, of course, we don't just grieve, we stage it. Lincoln's death was the original rehearsal. After the assassination, the U.S. went on a monument binge. Statues of Lincoln sprouted up everywhere, on courthouse lawns, in town squares, in cemeteries. Suddenly, we weren't just burying presidents, we were immortalizing them. But here's the catch. Each statue, each memorial told a slightly different story. In the North, he's the savior. In black communities, he's the liberator. In some Southern textbooks, he's the tyrant. In D.C., he's the godlike stone figure looking down on history. We didn't just remember Lincoln, we curated him. And every group shaped his memory into the version that fit their own story best. Because when trauma hits, we don't just remember the dead, we use them. Now here's where it gets really American. When Lincoln died, the economy around his death exploded. There were mourning pins with his face on them, lithographs of the assassination scene, fake relics sold at markets, authentic pieces of the blood-stained chair, often just red paint on wood, sheet music, plays, poems, handkerchiefs. It was like the 19th century version of viral merch drops, and Ford's Theater? It became part of that commercial afterlife. Today, it's a blend of tribute and tourism. You can sit in a replica chair, buy a souvenir, take a selfie. It's sacred, but also kind of a gift shop. And that's the paradox Lincoln left us with. We honor our heroes, but we also package them. Here's the thing people forget. In 1865, America wasn't just a country, it was a story. A big, messy, sometimes delusional story about freedom, progress, and divine mission. People believed deeply that America was chosen by God, that the Civil War was a test, and that Lincoln's leadership was proof of moral alignment with heaven. So when he died, not just died, but was murdered right after winning the war, that didn't just feel like political chaos. It felt like a cosmic betrayal. Wait, why would God let this happen? Why let the country's moral compass get shot in the face during a play about laughter and mistaken identity? This was no ordinary loss. It was a shattering of faith. In churches across the country, sermons turned apocalyptic. Some ministers claimed Lincoln's death was divine punishment. For slavery, for war, for pride. Others said Lincoln was a Christ figure, sacrificed for the sins of the nation. Seriously. People compared Ford's Theater to Golgotha, Booth, a modern-day Judas, Lincoln, the slain messiah of democracy. It sounds dramatic, but when you're watching your world fall apart, drama is all you've got. And this drama wasn't just poetic, it was strategic. Turning Lincoln into a martyr gave his legacy religious immunity. You don't question a martyr, you worship them. And just like that, the messy human president became an eternal symbol of justice, even if the justice never came. After the assassination, people started asking a question that still lingers today. Does America actually deserve to succeed? Think about it. We fought a brutal war to end slavery. Sort of. We saved the Union. Barely. And then, just as we're about to step into the light, boom, the light flickers out. People wondered, maybe we weren't chosen. Maybe we're just another empire pretending to be a miracle. For the first time, Americans looked into the mirror of history and saw chaos staring back. And for some, that was the first crack in the armor of American exceptionalism. Here's the twist. Instead of unraveling entirely, America did what it does best: rebrand the pain. We leaned harder into nationalism, into myth, into the idea that Lincoln's sacrifice made us special. He died for freedom. He died for the Union. He died so we could be reborn. But beneath that patriotic glow was something darker, a gnawing feeling that maybe this country wasn't destined. Maybe it had to earn its future. And maybe that future would always come soaked in blood. That faith-shaking feeling, it never really left. You see it after JFK, after 9/11s, after every school shooting, every political assassination attempt, every moment when chaos grabs the mic. We still ask, where was justice? Why now? What does this say about who we are? Lincoln's death was the first national moment where the story broke, where destiny didn't show up, where the good guy died before the end credits rolled. And every generation since has carried that wound. Some call it cynicism. Others call it maturity. Maybe it's just the cost of growing up as a country. All right, the president's just been murdered. The shooter leapt from the balcony, shouting in Latin. The Capitol is in chaos. The war is barely over. You think people were going to just accept a simple, clean explanation? Pfft. Please. Conspiracy theories bloomed like weeds. Not just in newspapers, but in barbershops, saloons, church pews, and back alley poker games. Some said Booth didn't act alone. Others said Booth was a decoy, or had escaped. Some said Secretary of War Edwin Stanton orchestrated it. Others blamed the Catholic Church, the British, the French, or why not, a secret Southern shadow government operating out of Cuba. It was like the 1865 version of Reddit exploded. Here's what actually happened. Yes, John Wilkes Booth was the triggerman, but he wasn't acting alone. He was part of a small but very real conspiracy to kill not just Lincoln, but also Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward on the same night. Total regime change, American style. Seward was stabbed in his bed, but survived. The guy assigned to kill Johnson chickened out. Only Booth succeeded. So, yeah, there was a real plot. But the problem was, real conspiracies are messy, stupid, and full of screw-ups. Which is why people always prefer the cinematic version. After Booth was cornered and allegedly shot in a barn in Virginia, people didn't believe it. Not everyone anyway. Why? Because the body was too burned. Because the soldiers buried it fast. Because the government was tight-lipped. Within weeks, rumors swirled. That wasn't Booth. He escaped to India. He's living in South America with Confederate gold. Some claimed to see him years later. Some even tried to dig up graves, demanding DNA tests before DNA was even a thing. In 1903, a man named David E. George died by suicide in Oklahoma. On his deathbed, he claimed to be John Wilkes Booth. His mummified body was literally put on display at carnivals for decades. Because this is America, and of course it was. Here's the thing about conspiracy theories. They aren't just about paranoia. They're about control. Lincoln's assassination was too big, too chaotic, too random. And people hate randomness. They'd rather believe in a dark puppet master than admit we live in a world where one angry actor can change history with a gun and a grudge. It's the same reason people still debate JFK's grassy knoll 9/11ths being an inside job, moon landings, reptilians, lizard monarchs. Because truth without meaning is scary, and conspiracies, however nuts, offer structure. Booth wasn't just a killer. He became the origin story of national mistrust. The reaction to the conspiracy wasn't just emotional. It was political. The government responded with widespread arrests, military tribunals executions, including Mary Surratt, the first woman executed by the U.S. government. They rounded up anyone remotely connected to Booth, whether they had full knowledge or just rented him a room. It was panic, cloaked in justice, but it also set a precedent. When a national trauma hits, civil liberties shrink. Lincoln's death helped justify tighter control over dissent, more federal policing, The idea that national security could override due process. Sound familiar? This wasn't just a conspiracy panic. It was the birth of the surveillance state mindset. Okay, deep breath. You've made it this far. Lincoln is dead. The war is over. The Union is restored. But now comes the real challenge. How do you rebuild a nation you just tore in half? Reconstruction was supposed to be that process. It could have been the beginning of a truly multiracial democracy, a reset button, a bold, radical rebirth of America. But with Lincoln gone, that dream didn't just stall, it crashed into a wall. Let's talk about the man who took over. Andrew Johnson, Tennessee Democrat, former slaveholder, deeply racist. Imagine handing your fragile dream to the one guy in the room who actively hates dreams. Lincoln had plans. He wanted amnesty for most Southerners, but only after they swore loyalty. He wanted to protect the rights of formerly enslaved people. He wanted, cautiously, to give them a stake in the future. Johnson, he wanted to move on. No protections, no accountability, no vote for black men. Just, let's patch things up with the South and forget this whole war business. He vetoed civil rights bills. He pardoned Confederate leaders. He called Reconstruction efforts a form of tyranny. It was like replacing your doctor with a guy who thinks infections cure themselves. For a few flickering years, Reconstruction actually worked, despite Johnson. Black men were elected to Congress. New state governments banned slavery, expanded education, and rebuilt economies. It was messy, imperfect, but real. But without Lincoln's leadership, Congress was constantly at war with the White House. Reconstruction became a political tug-of-war, not a shared vision. And while the North got tired of fighting, the South never stopped. They clawed back power with black codes, paramilitary terror groups like the KKK, voter suppression, so surgical it would make modern gerrymandering blush. By 1877, Reconstruction was dead, and America had quietly decided, equality can wait. Here's the chilling part. Would Reconstruction have succeeded if Lincoln had lived? We'll never know. But we do know this. With him gone, there was no national figure with both the moral weight and the political capital to hold it all together. Congress tried. Radical Republicans pushed. Black communities resisted. But Lincoln had that weird, rare thing. Trust. The North trusted him not to be vengeful. Some in the South, strangely, trusted him to be fair. And black Americans saw him rightly as the man who had opened the door. With him gone, the country slammed it shut. That's not just tragedy. That's lost potential. So, what filled the vacuum left by Lincoln and by Reconstruction's failure? Jim Crow laws, lynch mobs, poll taxes. Separate but equal lies. A Supreme Court that closed its eyes to injustice for decades. This wasn't just a setback. It was a second betrayal. For millions of black Americans, Lincoln's death didn't mark the end of slavery. It marked the start of a new nightmare, freedom without protection. And that wound stretched from 1865 to Selma, to Ferguson, to today. Here's something weird. If you walk around Washington, D.C., or Springfield, Illinois, or honestly, any small town with a statue budget, you'll find Abraham Lincoln everywhere. He's standing, he's sitting, he's thinking, he's towering over people like a moral lighthouse carved out of stone. And you'd think that kind of memorial treatment was reserved for people whose legacy is settled. But Lincoln's? Oh no. His legacy became a tug of war. See, after his death, Lincoln didn't just belong to history. He became a symbol, and symbols can be rewritten, depending on the decade and the political climate. Lincoln was the great emancipator, except he wasn't always so great at it. The defender of the Union, the Southern betrayer, the model Republican, the progressive icon, the constitutional conservative, the log cabin everyman, or the saint in the stovepipe hat. Basically, everyone wanted to say, Lincoln would have agreed with me. And none of them wanted to say Lincoln was complicated, flawed, and evolving. Because that's not great on a bumper sticker. Fast forward to the 20th century. Lincoln's image is now on the penny $5 bill, Mount Rushmore National Mall, and every social studies classroom poster from 1950 onward. But here's what we don't talk about. Many of those monuments, especially during the Jim Crow era, weren't about honoring Lincoln. They were about controlling his memory. Southern states would build statues of Lincoln the Reconciler, not Lincoln the Liberator. Why? Because reconciliation equals unity, and unity equals don't talk about racial justice. Even the famous Lincoln Memorial in D.C., unveiled in 1922, was segregated at its dedication. Yes, you heard that right. The statue of the man who ended slavery was unveiled in a ceremony where black attendees were forced to sit in a separate section. Irony? No, that's America. This question didn't stop with the 1920s. In the 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. He invoked Lincoln by name, not to praise America, but to call it out for breaking its promises. In other words, thanks for the Emancipation Proclamation. Where's the rest of it? Decades later, politicians on both sides still invoke Lincoln. Some quote him while pushing for civil rights. Others do it while passing voting restrictions. Some claim his Republican legacy. Others claim his vision of equality. But here's the real truth. Dead heroes can't argue, so we fill their silence with whatever suits us. The problem with turning Lincoln into a god is that it lets us off the hook. It says, he did the hard part. He solved the big moral crisis. Now we're good. But we're not. And by turning Lincoln into a marble statue instead of a man, we avoid asking the tough questions. What if he was learning as he went? What if emancipation was political and moral? What if he didn't finish the job? And what if it's our job to continue it? Because if Lincoln's just a saint, then there's nothing left to do. But if he was human, then maybe we're the sequel. There's a new election on the horizon. Half the country thinks democracy is collapsing. The other half thinks it's already gone. People are arguing in the comments section like it's a battlefield. You scroll past a meme of Abraham Lincoln with sunglasses. It says, "What would Abe do?" Cute. But underneath the joke is a ghost. Because in a very real way, Lincoln is still dying. Not in the theater, not in history books, but in our collective memory, our political morality, our willingness to listen to each other. Lincoln's death was supposed to mark the end of division, but maybe it was just the beginning of how we learn to live with it. Today, we talk about the left and the right like rival kingdoms. We fight over what books kids can read. We debate whether racism ended in 1865 or never really left. We ask, whose America is this anyway? And in all of that noise, we keep invoking Lincoln like a referee. Lincoln believed in unity. Lincoln would have supported this bill. Lincoln's party stood for this. But the truth? If Lincoln walked into Congress today, they wouldn't quote him. They'd tear him apart on Twitter in 12 minutes flat. Here's what stings. Lincoln died before Reconstruction really began. He died before Black Americans got full rights. He died before the South was rebuilt, before the North held itself accountable, before the country truly faced what it had become. And every time we ignore that unfinished work, every time we pretend the Civil War is ancient history, every time we slap his name on a quote he never said, we replay the assassination, not with a bullet, but with forgetting. Maybe the most honest way to honor Lincoln isn't with statues, stamps, or sound bites. Maybe it's with courage. The courage to challenge our own side. The courage to change our minds. The courage to face our contradictions without running. The courage to mourn and still move forward. Because Lincoln didn't just free the enslaved. He tried to free the country from its own worst instincts. And then, someone shot him for it. So here we are. The lights have come up, the war is long over, but the battle for the soul of America, that's still playing. And the question is no longer just what was America's role in the Cold War, or what did Lincoln believe? The question is, what are we going to do with the unfinished story he left behind? What does Lincoln mean to you in this moment, in this country? Not the textbook version, not the coin or the monument, but the man, the loss, the legacy. Comment below. Let's finish the story together. Hit like if you believe history is still happening right now. Subscribe if you want more truth with scars and teeth.